You should know who he is by the first name alone.
Bonzi baseline.
Bonzi Wells all the way. Bonzi for the win. Yes! It's all over. Bonzi Wells has won it.
He was instant offense at every stop of his career.
Fresh legs tonight. Great energy. Playing like a young guy, having a lot of fun.
But he did it a little differently. Sure, he had the one-on-one skills to blow by his man on the perimeter and get to his spots.
Well, you talk about players who can create a shot off of the dribble, and Bonzi Wells just gave a clinic right there.
But really, Bonzi Wells was a big man trapped in a guard's body.
Bonzi Wells, a terrific low-post player.
Well, he really does have center skills. He loves it in there where the contact is, in the mud, the blood, and the beer. I mean, that's where he's at his best.
A player that never shied away from the contact.
Bonzi at 6'5" and very powerful.
He's a tough guy to handle when he's in close to the bucket anyway.
That's just an old-fashioned butt kicking right there. Bonzi just loves to get in there and mix it up.
You may not have known what to expect from Bonzi every night, but if he got going, you knew you were in trouble.
He's one of the great screen shooters in the NBA.
He is the kind of player that if you get him started, particularly down in the low post, it's very difficult to shut him down.
44 for Bonzi.
An Indiana basketball legend, Wells made his name at Ball State before embarking on a solid decade-long NBA career. It wasn't seamless, but he played hard wherever he went.
Bonzi Wells trying to find a home. It's been a turbulent career so far for Bonzi. He's a talented guy.
He was never a superstar or even an all-star, but Bonzi Wells was a master of momentum. Just give him a few minutes, and he could completely turn the tide.
No hesitation. It's major dunkage by the Bonzinator.
Let's jog your memory. Born and raised in Muncie, Indiana, Bonzi Wells attended Muncie Central High School. Well, technically not Bonzi Wells.
Whose given name is Juan D'Angelo Wells. He got the nickname Bonzi because his mom ate bonbons all the time while she was pregnant with him.
So he was born Gawan. His mother's craving led to the nickname Bonbon. Then not long after that, he became Bonzi, and he'd waste no time making that name known as a member of the Bearcats. In his first varsity game, Wells put up 37 and 16 with 7 steals and 3 blocks. It was just one game, but everyone knew a star had been born. Wells fractured his ankle midway through the season, and not even that could stop him. He had been so good that coaches around Indiana looked at him as one of the state's top players going into his senior season. But outside of Indiana, he was still relatively unknown, so he'd stay in Indiana, and not just in Indiana, but in Muncie. Ball State University had hired Ray McCallum as their next head coach. Wells had lived across the street from McCallum's parents his entire life, so it was a no-brainer. Bonzi Wells was going to be a Cardinal, but he still had his senior season to play, and he didn't disappoint. Wells averaged about 24 and 10 and did a bit of everything. The Bearcats went 24 and 2, and Wells ended his high school career with quite a few awards, including an All-State selection and a runner-up finish for Indiana's Mr. Basketball. Next up was college, and Wells had some pressure. He was challenged by McCallum to bring some credibility to a struggling program. Bonzi Wells joined a Ball State program that had just been probed for major violations the year prior and narrowly avoided being banned from postseason play. So the Cardinals under McCallum were trying to rebuild their image, and so was Wells. He had been a member of the Indiana All-Star team over the summer, but was voted off the team after a couple incidents, which included him arriving late for a game. Reportedly still upset about his Mr. Basketball snub, the All-Star team coach said it was because the people around him were telling him he should be. Wells felt more like that coach was trying to make him look bad, and didn't have much interest in playing for him. Regardless, there were now some concerns around the soon-to-be freshman's attitude as he joined a Ball State team led by forward Steve Payne and guard Marcus Norris. But Wells would soon quiet those concerns and turn that duo into a trio. Wells was a day one starter. The third game of the season pitted the Cardinals against their first D1 opponent. Bonzi Wells went for a game-high 25 points, and from there, he became a key piece of the offense. Even though Wells was 6'5" and around 200 pounds, he was strong and physical and would bully his way to the hoop. So even if he was giving up size down low, he was rarely at a disadvantage. And with some deceptive quickness, which allowed him to beat his man off the dribble, he was a handful on offense. It was the same story on the boards. Bonzi Wells loved the contact and never gave up on a missed shot. He was second on the Cardinals in both scoring and rebounding. And then there were his steals. Whether it was jumping passing lanes or knocking the ball loose, Wells just had instincts. It led to the freshman leading the Mid-American Conference in steals at nearly 3 per game. Bonzi Wells was the future of Ball State basketball. When he played well, so did the Cardinals. And the team as a whole was solid in '95. They ended the season at 16-10. Their 16th win in the season finale against Ohio was a career-changing game for Wells.
He would be the first one in 21 years in a Cardinal uniform to hit the magic 4-0. Come on, Bonzi, put it in. Yes! Standing ovation for the Memphis Central freshman.
Bonzi dominated the Bobcats, as not only would Wells set a conference freshman scoring record with 40 points, but he would also get himself noticed.
It's an interesting story about Wells. You know, a couple of weeks ago, he got 40 points playing against Ohio. But what was interesting is there were 7 scouts at the game to watch Trent and Payne, and who'd they come away talking about? This freshman right here, Bonzi Wells.
So it was a winning season for the Cardinals, with their MAC Rookie of the Year. But finishing 4th in a mid-major conference definitely doesn't guarantee an NCAA tournament berth. However, winning the conference tournament does. BSU got through Bowling Green after Wells dropped 11 points in the final 4 minutes. Next, Wells dropped 22 as BSU knocked off a favored Miami of Ohio team, setting up a conference championship showdown with Eastern Michigan. Wells had a rough shooting day in the final, going 6 of 22 from the field, but he still dropped 14 points and added 11 rebounds. Ball State were conference champions and had guaranteed their spot in the NCAA tournament, set to take on Arizona State in round 1. Unfortunately, their tournament run wouldn't last long. Wells finished with 16 points and 10 boards. He added 3 blocks and 2 steals, but a lot of his scoring came late when the game was already out of reach, as the Sun Devils knocked off the Cardinals, and Wells ended his freshman season with averages of about 16 points, 6 rebounds, and 3 steals per game. Steve Payne was Ball State's best player in '95. Now he was graduated. They needed their new leader, and they found one in their sophomore forward. Coaches throughout the MAC conference were raving about Wells. There was just so much he could do on the court, and he was effective on both ends. Losing Payne meant Ball State lost a lot of rebounding, so Wells became one of the best rebounders in the conference. He scored well last year, but this year he turned into one of the best scorers in the entire country. His career-high 25.4 points per game, good for 5th in the NCAA. And just like last year, he led the MAC in steals, except now he was forcing over 3 turnovers per game. Bonzi Wells was a star, and Ball State would go as far as he would take them. But that was the problem. Ball State didn't have much else outside of Wells, so if he didn't go off, their chances of winning plummeted. And even if he did, a win wasn't guaranteed. So Wells spent the year doing everything he could to keep the Cardinals competitive. He was named the top player in the Mid-American Conference and carried Ball State to a respectable 15-11 finish. But like last year, their only hope for a tournament appearance would be to win the conference championship. They got through Ohio in the quarterfinals, but Eastern Michigan got their revenge for last year and ran through Ball State in the semis, as Wells wrapped up his season with averages of about 25.5 points, 9 rebounds, and 3 steals per game. Bonzi Wells had just broken out as a sophomore. He may not have been on every NBA team's radar, but his hometown team was already very interested. In the end, Wells opted to return for his junior year, but now he had confirmation that Ball State wouldn't be the end of his basketball career. With Bonzi Wells on the team, Ball State believers were optimistic, yet it was much of the same story in '97. The Cards had a bit more of a balanced attack, but Wells was still far and away their go-to guy. On paper, his numbers made it look like he had taken a step back after seeing dips in his scoring and rebounding. However, he was still top 5 in the conference in both categories. And while he put up his lowest steal average of his Ball State career, it was still 2.5 per game. But Wells wasn't surprising anyone in year 3. Everyone knew the caliber of player he was, and everyone built their game plan around containing him. So like any good player, Wells adapted. When defenses came at him, he found the open man. and averaged a career-high 4.4 assists per game. He even recorded the first triple-double in school history. But Wells also felt like he had to be the one to make things happen. He'd often get caught up trying to do too much, and his assist averages were essentially nullified by his 4.3 turnovers per game. Nonetheless, he still earned his second straight first-team All-MAC selection. So Wells was playing a bit of a different game, but the Ball State offense still revolved around him.
We mentioned a 41% point production for Bonzi for Ball State in all MAC games. It's 30% for the rest of the season, but 41% of all Ball State points in the conference scored by Bonzi.
But again, Bonzi versus everyone wasn't the best strategy for winning basketball. The Cardinals had actually gotten out to an impressive 6-1 start, but that's where they peaked. Their 500 finish in conference play was the worst in Wells' time there, and overall, they finished the season at 16-12, before again being knocked out of the conference tourney by Eastern Michigan, as Wells wrapped up his junior year with averages of about 22 points, 8 rebounds, and 2.5 steals per game. Bonzi Wells had been consistently great over the past 3 years. Going into his senior season, he was a surefire NBA prospect, with one more year to work his way up the draft board. The game was already there. This year was about maturing. He vowed to be a more controlled player, specifically by avoiding the mental lapses that had plagued his career up to this point. And fortunately, he had a lot less reason to get upset, because Ball State put together a great season. They were one of the higher scoring teams in the nation and were above average in points allowed. Wells reclaimed his spot as the best scorer in the MAC. And while Wells loved getting physical in the paint, he played more of a finesse game as a senior, spending a lot more time on the perimeter, expected to create his own shot. But the main reason why Ball State was so dangerous was the turnover game. They disrupted their opponents and got easy buckets on the other end. Bonzi Wells was the ultimate thief. He averaged an incredible 3.6 steals per game. No one in the country forced more turnovers than the Ball State forward. The Cards got out to another hot start, but this year, they sustained it. They never lost 2 games in a row, and with a 14-4 record in conference play, they were the MAC regular season champs. And in a late February game against Northern Illinois, Wells made history.
World was lifted from Bonzi Wells' shoulders on Saturday, becoming the all-time Mid-American Conference scoring leader with a thunderous dunk against Northern Illinois.
With that dunk, Wells surpassed Ron Harper as the all-time leading scorer in the Mid-American Conference. He was voted MAC Player of the Year and led a favored Ball State team into the conference tourney. However, after running through Marshall, they were knocked out by Eastern Michigan for the 3rd straight year. The Cardinals were 21-7 at this point, but they'd be passed over for an NCAA tournament bid. They would get a postseason after receiving an NIT invite, but it lasted just 1 game, a loss to Memphis, ending their season. As Wells wrapped up his senior year with averages of about 23 points, 6.5 rebounds, and 3.5 steals per game. So Wells left Ball State as the Mid-American Conference's all-time leader in points and steals. He spent his summer getting ready for the NBA draft. The consensus agreement was that he was a first-round talent. Magic Johnson even felt like he had a great chance to go top 10. In the end, Johnson was wrong, but he also wasn't far off.
With the 11th pick in the 1998 NBA draft, the Detroit Pistons select Bonzi Wells from Ball State University.
So Bonzi Wells was heading to Detroit to play alongside Grant Hill, except Wells would never suit up in a Pistons uniform. Just a couple weeks before the lockout-shortened season began, Wells was sent to Portland. The Blazers looked at Wells as a player to develop, but they liked the upside, confident that Wells would become a great two-way player for the team. A Blazers team that was starting to make some noise out west, known especially for their depth.
I got to go. J.R. Ryder, Jimmy Jackson at the 2. You got Damon Stoudemire, Gary Grant at the point. Greg Anthony at the point. Walt Williams, Stacey Augmon at the 3. Rasheed and Brian Grant at the 4. Sabonis and Jermaine O'Neal at the 5. So these are like real names. So I'm just sitting back in this mug like, man, I don't know if I'm ever going to play.
So Wells was pretty sure he'd spend year 1 glued to the bench. And he was absolutely right. He appeared in just 7 games and played less than 40 minutes across the entire season. But for Wells, it was still an opportunity to learn. And he quickly learned that watching the NBA and playing in the NBA are 2 very different things. And although Wells didn't really see the court, he did see some winning. Portland was one of the best teams in the league. They went 35-15 and made it to the conference finals before falling to the Spurs in 4 games. However, Wells had been left off the playoff roster, as he finished his rookie year with averages of about 4.5 points, 1.5 rebounds, and half an assist per game. Over the offseason, the Blazers acquired 6-time NBA champion Scottie Pippen and former NBA All-Star Steve Smith. Wells wouldn't be a starter anytime soon, but Portland did have to give up a lot to get those two guys, so there'd be more minutes for Wells in year 2, and he only helped his case with a great showing at Summer League. Portland remained one of the most complete teams in the NBA, still featuring guys like Rasheed Wallace and Damon Stoudemire. Wells was a bench player, but he was a much more consistent part of the rotation, and even though he was receiving less than 18 minutes a night, he was Portland's top bench scorer. Wells was strong enough to post up smaller guards, but also had the quickness to blow past bigger guards on the perimeter. He was instant offense and quickly became one of the better ISO players in the league. He would miss about a month early in the season with a knee injury, but whenever Wells was on the court, he was out for blood. He wanted to make an impact with every opportunity. And with the way Wells was playing, when he came in to relieve Steve Smith, the Portland attack was just as dangerous. The Blazers knew exactly what to expect from their second-year swingman. The same couldn't be said for opposing coaches. And Wells was just one of many Blazer weapons. By this point, Portland was a legit contender. They weren't the flashiest or the most exciting, but they got it done. They ended the year with 59 wins, which was good for the 3rd seed in the West. They began the postseason against the Minnesota Timberwolves, and this year, Bonzi was on the roster. Head coach Mike Dunleavy leaned more on his veterans in the first-round series. Wells got minimal playing time over the first 2 games and struggled, then was benched for the rest of the series. However, the Blazers wrapped it up in 4, as they moved on to a second-round matchup with Utah. It looked like another series where Wells would be stuck on the bench after he played 4 minutes in Game 1, but in Game 2, Dunleavy let Bonzi loose.
Wells, great post move again, this time on the left block. Jazz not converting when the Blazers do turn it over. Now Russell on the post defense. Wells says, forget about it. I'm going to make contact, go to the baseline, and hit the phone. They have been confounding. To the baseline, Wells looking to move as he sweeps right by Hornacek as if it were an open door.
He went for 17 points in 18 minutes off the bench. The next game, he dropped 19 points in less than 15 minutes. Utah's smaller guards had no answer for Wells in the post, and the Blazers went up 3 games to none. Game 4 was a close loss for Portland, so Wells was seldom used. Then while Game 5 was much of the same for Wells, the difference was that Portland won and were making a return to the conference finals. The Blazers' opponent was the Los Angeles Lakers, but Wells didn't look too bothered by the bright lights of LA. Over the first 2 games, he averaged about 15 points and 5 rebounds. He caused the Lakers a lot of problems with his work inside.
One thing that Phil Jackson had talked about is he was very concerned about Bonzi Wells' ability in that low post. Felt like he was a wild card, so he's very aware of what he can do in that low block.
And he didn't back down from the challenge of guarding Kobe Bryant. Portland headed back home with the series tied, but the Lakers made adjustments. And over the next 3 games, Wells struggled as Portland found themselves on the brink of elimination. But with their season on the line, Wells came through.
He fires it over Shaq, and it comes up short. Bonzi Wells on the offensive glass. Bonzi Wells gets inside again. Bonzi Wells looking for 20, and he's got it.
He only played about 18 minutes off the bench, but he dropped 20 points on over 60% shooting. He was a big reason why the Blazers were able to force a Game 7. But then 2 nights later came the infamous 4th quarter collapse, as Portland fell just short of a finals appearance. And Wells finished year 2 with averages of about 9 points, 3 rebounds, and a steal per game. After 2 straight conference finals appearances, Portland had to run it back, and knowing they'd probably meet the Lakers again, they sent a promising young Jermaine O'Neal to Indiana for veteran forward Dale Davis. Wells would continue in his bench role to start the season, and knew that if he wanted a promotion, he had to work for it. He came back in better shape, and over the first 2 months of the year, he was not only putting up better numbers, but he was doing so more efficiently, and you couldn't help but wonder what he could do with starter minutes. Then on December 29th, no one had to wonder anymore.
Bonzi Wells has taken Steve Smith's spot in the starting rotation, and he is playing phenomenally since being inserted into the starting lineup.
Well, I just want to come out here and play hard. You know, coaches give me an opportunity just to use my young legs and just run a little bit, you know, with the starting group, and that's what I'm trying to do, just fill the lanes and make something happen.
Wells had waited patiently and was ready. Over his first 11 games as a starter, he averaged 16.5 points, 6.5 boards, and 3.5 assists per game. He shot nearly 60% and was good for about a steal and a half each night. And the best part? Portland lost just one game during that stretch. With Wells on the court, they could play faster, and he offered more on defense than an aging Steve Smith. And overall, he was just a matchup nightmare. Teams were trying all sorts of defensive strategies to contain the versatile swingman, but Bonzi just kept burning them. He had cemented his spot in the Blazers starting lineup, and they needed him badly, as a lot of their veterans were breaking down. Things couldn't have been going better for Wells in year 3, but then Bonzi went down. With just 5 games left in the regular season, Wells tore his ACL. His year was over. Portland still made the playoffs, but their rematch with the Lakers was over pretty quickly. And Wells ended his year with averages of about 12.5 points, 5 rebounds, and 1.5 steals per game. Portland liked the way they played with the younger Wells, but he would be coming back from a major knee injury, and they needed some insurance. So they moved on from Steve Smith, sending him to San Antonio in exchange for a younger swingman in Derek Anderson. However, they still had a deep and talented team, maybe even too deep, as Dunleavy had his troubles juggling minutes last year. So GM Bob Whitsitt's solution was to fire Dunleavy and bring in Maurice Cheeks for his first NBA head coaching gig. But for Wells, there remained a lot of question marks. Would he be ready when the season began? And would he be the Bonzi Wells that Portland fans knew and loved? Bonzi Wells immediately put any concerns to bed. He was the same player and then some come the following season. He came off the bench for the season opener, but got his first start the next night. He played over 41 minutes and dropped 33 points. He had 2 more 30-point outings over his next 6 games, and he was cleaning up on the glass. Wells was making it a point to show everyone that he was just fine. He would miss a few games in December, but overall, Wells was healthy and playing like he had never been injured. His new coach felt like he was on the cusp of legit stardom, and the numbers backed up that claim. Wells was the team's second leading scorer on a career-high average, and was second in steals, while finishing third on the team in rebounding. Wells was playing the best basketball of his career on both sides of the ball. However, the Blazers were playing some of their worst basketball in years, heading into the All-Star break just 2 games above 500, and the fans weren't happy. Earlier in the year, Wells had put himself in some hot water with Blazers faithful. The team wasn't looking good, and they were hearing boos coming from their own fans. Some comments from Wells appeared in a Sports Illustrated article published in late December, which wouldn't go over too well. In response to their booing, Wells said their fans really don't matter to them. Besides, they'll still ask them for autographs. And that definitely wasn't a great thing to hear from one of your best players, who was set to be a free agent after the season. But Wells later explained that it came out of frustration. He said that he had nothing but love for the fans. Most importantly, he said he had no plans to leave the team. He loved Portland. And not to mention, this was a brutal article that completely ripped apart Portland's players and management. And Bonzi's comments were the least of the Blazers' worries. But fast forward to a couple games after the All-Star break, and the Blazers get on a roll, winning 12 straight to put them firmly in the playoff picture. And they needed this streak, as they would return to playing 500 ball for the remainder of the season. But still, a 49-33 finish was enough for the playoffs. Portland got another crack at the Lakers, this time with a healthy Bonzi Wells. The Blazers lost Game 1. Wells played a good all-around game, but 8 points wasn't going to cut it. Next game was 10 points, on 3 of 11 shooting, and another Blazers loss. Finally, in Game 3, Wells had a great showing. 19 points, 6 boards, 5 assists, and 5 steals. It was close, but the Lakers again pulled it out. Just like that, Portland's season was over, and Wells ended his comeback year with averages of about 17 points, 6 rebounds, and 1.5 steals per game. There were ups and downs, but overall, Bonzi Wells had turned in a career year coming off an ACL tear, and had done so during a contract year. And while it wasn't the easiest negotiation, in the end, Portland re-signed Wells for 3 years and about $20 million in early October. It was the least they could do, after fining him $50,000 for those comments he made. So for now, Wells was happy. Wells returned to a Blazers team who looked pretty similar to last year, the one main difference being Derek Anderson taking over for Damon Stoudemire as the team's starting point guard. Wells didn't have the best start to the season, but by December he had found his groove. He would again act as Portland's second leading scorer behind Wallace, and tie for the team lead in steals. But there was a lot of dysfunction in Portland. Wells faced suspension for on-court incidents twice this season, yet it was his own fault. Bonzi Wells had developed a reputation in the league as an instigator. He talked a lot, and he got under the skin of a lot of players. Sometimes, things escalated, like on December 20th, when Wells was in the middle of a post-game brawl. Wells had 28 points, and Portland won the game. But he also had Warriors forward Chris Mills trying whatever he could to get a piece of Wells after the game. And according to some Portland players, Mills wasn't playing around. On top of this incident, it seemed like every month there was a Blazers player wrapped up in some sort of controversy. And Mo Cheeks was more of a player's coach. The players liked him, but he wasn't much of a disciplinarian. So it seemed like Portland's season was unraveling. But then the year comes to an end, and the Blazers have 50 wins. A testament to the sheer abundance of talent that Portland had. Even after one of the most drama-filled seasons of any NBA team ever, Portland was back in the playoffs. This time, they had a new opponent, and Bonzi Wells quickly introduced himself.
Open for the moment, had the smaller Daniels, who strips the ball away, and Wells on the...
As he works against Bradley. Wells against Finley, 10 to shoot. Finley falls, and Bonzi fills it up.
Played by Dallas there, going inside to the post, and then screen.
Bonzi Wells!
Heating up as Dallas recaptures the lead. Wells to the fake. Yes! Oh, tough shot. Wells wants a three. That's through! Oh, Wells responds to Nowitzki's fire from deep.
After a quiet Game 1 double-double, Wells exploded for a career-high 45 points in Game 2, which included him draining 5 out of 6 3-balls, following a season where he shot below 30% from deep. But it wasn't looking good for Portland, because even with that performance, they had lost. Wells shot 3 of 16 the next game, and Portland was down 3-0. Then over the next 2, Wells went a combined 11 of 43 from the field, yet somehow the Blazers won both. But even though his shot wasn't falling, Wells was making up for it in all the other areas. He was rebounding, passing, and forcing turnovers. Then an efficient performance from Wells in Portland would help the Blazers force a Game 7. But Wells would struggle. Portland would get caught up in foul trouble, and the improbable comeback would come up short, as Wells ended his year with averages of about 15 points, 5.5 rebounds, and 1.5 steals per game. Although Wells' overall season had been good, it was inconsistent. At times he played like a star, and at times he looked overmatched. His teammate Scottie Pippen questioned whether or not Wells truly wanted to be a star, or now his former teammate. Portland would make a lot of changes this year, and it started with not re-signing Pippen. This opened up space in the starting lineup for a third-year forward named Zach Randolph. Wells was still a starter, but he was struggling. 3 years earlier, he had the second highest field goal percentage in the entire league. After the first month of this season, he was shooting below 39% and was constantly butting heads with Cheeks. Portland also had a new GM in John Nash, replacing the man known to fans as Trader Bob Whitsitt. And Nash made a point to try and clean up the team's image and shed the Jailblazers label that they had been carrying for years. Wells had only had one small legal incident since joining the team, but there were still his on-court outbursts and outcry from some fans who didn't like the way he talked to the other players. Wells was quoted shortly before the season saying that he was committed to changing and doing better, while still being Bonzi, of course. But after Wells flipped off some fans and threw things onto the court during an early season loss, his bed was made, and he would end up being the next casualty, traded to Memphis in early December. Wells joined a Pau Gasol-led Grizzlies team, yet in Memphis, Wells' minutes were cut. He had averaged 31 minutes a night since becoming a full-time starter in Portland, but now, Wells was getting less than 25, and was coming off the bench most nights. Except it had less to do with him and more to do with head coach Hubie Brown.
Just a real one. He used to come to us every day. He's like, listen, I got about 9 of you that can play, and Pau Gasol is our man. Y'all gonna play 6 minutes on, 6 minutes off. I don't give a who starts. And we did that in my first year in Memphis, and I learned so much about the game in terms of execution, being consistent, and Hubie was just a teacher.
So it was a big change, but Wells respected Brown for his realness. Memphis brought structure that Wells had never had in Portland, and he looked like a rejuvenated player. Even though his minutes were lower, he was more efficient and scoring just as well as he had been during his first month in Portland. Wells was a starting caliber player, so whenever he was coming off the bench and going against the opponent's second unit, he was one of the best players on the court, and he became one of the better sixth men in the league. And a Grizzlies team that had never even reached 30 wins in their franchise history would surprise everyone with a 50-32 finish. Brown won Coach of the Year, and the Grizzlies secured their first ever playoff appearance, and the tough task of trying to get through the defending champion San Antonio Spurs. Wells continued coming off the bench in this series, but he was one of the best producers for Memphis. He averaged nearly 12 points on over 50% shooting. He hit double figures in each of his first 3 games. But this was still the defending champs versus a team with very little playoff experience. So after just 4 games, Memphis saw their season come to an end, as Wells' overall year had seen him average about 12.5 points, 3.5 rebounds, and 1.5 steals per game. So Memphis had been one of the biggest surprises of the 04 season. They brought back their entire core for 05. However, they would get off to a slow start, winning just 5 of their first 12. Then came the shocking news. Hubie Brown resigned. Memphis would quickly bring in Mike Fratello as his replacement. Wells had been a starter since the beginning of the season, but just a couple games after Fratello took over, he was back on the bench. Wells had his ups and downs, but overall this season was a step back. He was putting up his lowest scoring average in 5 years. However, he was hampered by lingering injuries all season, and he wasn't the only one, as a lot of Grizzlies missed a lot of time this year. But still, they managed another winning season, barely sneaking into the playoffs with a 45-37 record. But the relationship between Wells and Fratello had really soured down the stretch. Fratello had been using less players in his rotations. Wells had seen his minutes get cut dramatically. Hubie Brown was calculated. Mike Fratello's minutes allocation was performance-based. Even though the streaky Wells was a top 3 scorer on the team, Fratello must not have been happy with his performance. By the time their first-round series with Phoenix kicked off, Wells was barely a part of the rotation at all. He played a productive 16 minutes in Game 1. Then in Game 2, Wells never even took off his warm-ups. All Fratello had to say was that he played the guys who had good practices. Wells would then see brief second-half action in Game 3, and in Game 4, he wouldn't even dress. And another Grizzlies season ended in a sweep, with Wells wrapping up his year with averages of about 10.5 points, 3.5 rebounds, and a steal per game. Shortly after the loss, Fratello said that the benching was more due to strategy, but Fratello would also say that Wells was more focused on himself than the team goals, as the Grizzlies had the option on the final year of Wells' contract. Wells, however, felt it was a lot more simple. Fratello just didn't like him. Whatever it wasn't going to get resolved. So during the summer, Wells would be shipped to Sacramento, joining a fast-paced Kings team coached by Rick Adelman. The Kings had plenty of talent on the roster, with guys like Mike Bibby, Brad Miller, and Peja Stojakovic, and Wells would join them in the starting lineup, and it didn't hurt that he was a great fit for Adelman's playstyle. He drove to the hoop aggressively and had the physicality and post-game to play forward in a small ball lineup. He also proved to be a great rebounding presence. He was sneaky and relentless on the offensive glass, making sure that Sacramento got plenty of second chances. His 7.7 rebounds per game were a career high by a large margin, and on defense, Wells was one of the best at playing the passing lanes, recording nearly 2 steals per game and giving the Kings opportunities to get out in transition. The first couple months of the season saw Wells put up some of the best numbers of his career, bringing an element of toughness to Sacramento, and even coming up big in the clutch.
Bonzi for the win! Yes! It's all over! Bonzi Wells has won it for Sacramento! And if you don't like that, you don't like NBA basketball!
However, the Kings had gotten out to a slow start. Then in late December, Wells suffered a groin tear and would appear in just 2 games over the next 2.5 months. When he returned for good in early March, Stojakovic was gone, traded for defensive ace Ron Artest. Yet the Kings were still 3 games below 500. But with a healthy Wells down the stretch, Sacramento made a playoff push, winning 17 of their final 25 to finish at 44-38, securing them the West's final playoff spot and a date with the defending champion Spurs. Game 1 was nothing to write home about. Wells had 12 points and 6 boards, and the Kings didn't even put up a fight. But come Game 2, Bonzi Wells kicked off the series of his life. Wells dropped 19 in the first half and 28 in total. He added 12 rebounds and was the main reason why the Kings pushed the Spurs to overtime. Yet Wells had fouled out at the end of regulation, and San Antonio took over in the extra frame. Going back to Sacramento, the Kings were in an expected 0-2 hole. Game 3 was another double-double for Wells, 19 points and 14 rebounds. 10 of those came on the offensive glass. Sacramento had an abysmal shooting performance, but they stuck around and would get their first win of the series in dramatic fashion.
By Bibby, ahead to Martin, to the rim, and the Sacramento.
Then all of a sudden, it was knotted up. Sacramento got their own blowout win in Game 4. Wells dropped 25 points on 9 of 11 shooting and pulled down 17 boards. It was anyone's series heading back to San Antonio, and Tim Duncan knew that if the Spurs wanted to win, they had to contain number 42. Bonzi's Game 5 stat line, 38 points and 12 rebounds. So much for slowing him down. It was a near perfect performance, but it was all for naught, as few other Kings showed up. Then while Wells turned in another double-double in Game 6, it was the end of the line for Sacramento, as Wells would end his year with averages of about 13.5 points, 7.5 rebounds, and 2 steals per game. It had been a contract year for Bonzi Wells, and it couldn't have ended better for the now 8-year veteran. He was expecting a big payday to come his way. The Kings offered him $36 million over 5 years. Wells' agent turned it down and tried to play the waiting game in hopes of driving up the asking price on the open market, but he waited too long. Teams filled their needs, including the Kings. So Wells fired his agent and took what he could get. Shortly before the following season, he settled for a 2-year deal with Houston, worth just $5 million. It seemed like the Rockets had just got a steal, but Wells' first year in Houston never really took off. First, Wells would miss most of training camp with a variety of ailments. The season started, and Wells wasn't thrilled about his minutes. Head coach Jeff Van Gundy wasn't thrilled about the shape that Wells was in, so much so that he would put him on the inactive list, with the expectation that Wells would spend the time improving his conditioning. Eventually, Wells made his return in December. Even he admitted that he had been in a funk, understandable for someone who had just lost out on $30 million. Yet he was looking better, but after just 9 games, he would injure his back. He again returned a few weeks later, but then a foot injury would sideline him indefinitely. And finally, in April, Wells didn't report to a game, giving the reasoning that he felt he was disrupting team chemistry, which would ultimately spell the end of his season, as his 28 games with Houston had seen him average about 8 points, 4 rebounds, and a steal per game. Wells had a player option, and many felt that he would test free agency, but Houston had fired Jeff Van Gundy after another first-round exit, and his replacement was Wells' coach in Sacramento, Rick Adelman. So Wells decided to give it another go, and this time, things went much better. Wells was available and playing meaningful minutes off the bench for Houston, and this lasted until late February, when Wells was sent to New Orleans, joining a Hornets team who were challenging for a top seed in the West. Wells would become a solid rotational piece for the team over the final 2 months of the season, even recording a career-high 8 steals in a win over Boston. He helped them capture the 2 seed and get a first-round matchup with Dallas. Wells got solid minutes in the first-round series. He didn't have a huge impact, but he provided the Hornets with much-needed depth as they got through Dallas in 5 games. Round 2 brought San Antonio, and Wells kicked off the series with 10 points in a Game 1 win. He would never score like that again, but he was a good rebounding presence all series. However, San Antonio would outlast New Orleans and take it in 7, as Wells' year ended with averages of about 9 points, 4.5 rebounds, and a steal per game. New Orleans opted not to re-sign Wells, and the other teams around the league weren't offering him the type of money that he was looking for, so he'd take his talents overseas, signing on with the Chinese Basketball Association, where he would turn in some big-time performances. But his time in the CBA was brief after his contract was terminated when he didn't return to the team after the Chinese New Year. Wells would go on to spend a year playing in Puerto Rico and just barely miss an NBA comeback with the T-Wolves before joining the Big 3 League. But shortly after the 2017 season, Wells got the scare of his life. At just 40 years old, he suffered a heart attack. Luckily, he survived and made a full recovery, while learning that he had a blood clotting condition and would even still make a return to the Big 3. But this event would help influence him to shift from playing basketball to teaching it. becoming the head coach at HBCU Lemoyne-Owen for 2 seasons, before joining the Georgia Tech coaching staff as an assistant in 2023. Bonzi Wells is a great example of growth as a player and person. He had a lot of talent and a little maturity coming into the league. He was a fan favorite in Portland for how he played, but also showed that he had a lot of growing up to do. And while it wasn't overnight, he evolved throughout his career. He handled the issues in Memphis with more grace. He took accountability for his struggles in Houston. And while he may have bounced around teams always wanted him because he gave it his all whenever he was on the court. He wasn't a star, but he could play like one on any given night. And most important is that he's passing on his knowledge through his coaching career. As a player who made his fair share of mistakes, yet had the humility to learn from them. But that's it for today's episode on Bonzi Wells. Hope you enjoyed it, and make sure to subscribe for more videos like this one. If you liked it, check out this one on one of his Portland teammates, or this one on a guy he played with in Sacramento. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.